The phone buzzed on the kitchen counter at 11 at night, and Marcus Whitfield almost did not answer it because he thought it was another work email. He looked at the screen. It was Alina's sister, Nora. He never got calls from Nora, not once in 11 years of marriage. His hand went cold before his mind understood why. He answered. Nora's voice was shaking. She said one sentence that changed the shape of his life. Alina was in the hospital. She had collapsed at work. Nobody knew yet if she was going to be okay. Marcus stood in his kitchen in his socks, holding a phone that suddenly felt heavier than it should, and for the first time in years, he could not remember the last real conversation he had with his own wife. Not a hello, not a goodbye. A real conversation where he looked at her face and listened. Nora kept talking, her words tumbling faster than he could fully absorb them. A coworker had found Alina on the floor of the break room, unresponsive for almost a full minute before she opened her eyes again, confused, unable to say what day it was. An ambulance had been called. Nora had only found out because Alina's phone, sitting in her coat pocket, had lit up with a missed call from their mother, and a paramedic had answered it to explain what was happening. Marcus asked question after question, most of which Nora could not answer. He asked what hospital. He asked if Alina had said anything. He asked if this had happened before, a question that came out before he could stop it, a question that revealed, even to himself, how little he actually knew about his own wife's health over the past year. He grabbed his keys. He grabbed his coat. He did not grab his laptop, and that alone should have told him something about the last 3 years of his life. The drive to the hospital took 19 minutes. It felt like 19 hours. Every red light was an insult. Every slow car in front of him felt like the world itself was trying to keep him from her. He gripped the steering wheel so hard his knuckles turned pale, and in the silence of the car, memories he had buried under meetings and deadlines began climbing back to the surface. He remembered a woman who used to leave sticky notes in his lunch bag when they were newly married. Small jokes, little hearts. He could not remember the last time he had opened his lunch bag and found anything at all, because he could not remember the last time she had packed it. He remembered her laugh from years ago, loud and unfiltered, the kind of laugh that turned heads in restaurants. He tried to recall the last time he heard it. He could not. The hospital lights were too bright when he ran through the sliding doors. A nurse at the front desk asked for the patient's name, and his voice cracked when he said it. Alina Whitfield. The nurse typed slowly, too slowly, while his heart pounded against his ribs like it wanted out. They told him to wait. Waiting rooms are cruel places. They strip away every distraction a person uses to avoid their own thoughts. Marcus sat in a plastic chair that squeaked under him, and for the first time in a long time there was nothing to distract him. No phone call to take, no deadline to chase, just him and the truth he had been avoiding. He thought about the morning just 12 hours earlier when Alina had asked him a simple question over breakfast. She had asked if he remembered what day it was. He had guessed wrong. It was their anniversary, 11 years. She had smiled in a way that did not reach her eyes, said it was fine, and gone to work without finishing her coffee. He had not even noticed she left her coffee unfinished. He noticed it now, sitting in a plastic chair, replaying every second of that morning like a man trying to solve a puzzle after all the pieces had already scattered on the floor. A doctor finally came out. Young, tired eyes, kind voice. He said Alina was stable. Exhaustion, dehydration, and stress had pushed her body past its limit. She would recover physically. The doctor's next words landed differently. He said that whatever had been building up in her life for a long time had reached a breaking point, and her body had simply refused to carry it any further. Marcus asked if he could see her. The doctor said yes, but only for a short while. She needed rest. He walked into the room slowly, like a man walking into a place he did not deserve to be. Alina was lying on the hospital bed, an IV line taped to her hand, her face pale under the fluorescent light. She looked smaller than he remembered, not physically, something else, something he did not have a word for yet. Her eyes opened when he stepped closer. For a moment there was nothing on her face, no relief, no anger, just a quiet, tired stillness that scared him more than tears would have. He asked if she was okay. It was a stupid question, and he knew it the second it left his mouth. She did not answer right away. She looked at him for a long moment, the kind of look that studies a person, like she was trying to remember who he used to be. Then she said something he would carry with him for the rest of his life. She said she did not even remember the last time he had looked at her the way he was looking at her right now. Marcus opened his mouth to respond, but nothing came out, because she was right and they both knew it. He pulled a chair beside her bed and sat down. He reached for her hand, the one without the IV line, and she let him hold it, but her fingers did not curl around his the way they used to. They just rested there still, like she was too tired to reach back. He asked her what happened, not the medical answer, the real answer. What had actually happened to them, over these last months and years that he had somehow missed. She was quiet for a long time before she spoke. She told him she had been running on empty for longer than he probably realized. Work, the house, the bills, the invisible weight of a marriage where she felt like she was the only one still trying. She said she used to leave him small signs, small hopes, waiting for him to notice something was wrong, waiting for him to ask how she really was instead of asking what was for dinner. She said somewhere along the way she stopped waiting, not because she stopped caring, because waiting had started to hurt more than moving forward without him. Marcus felt something crack open in his chest. Not a dramatic collapse, but a slow, quiet fracture, the kind that happens when a person finally sees a truth they had been avoiding for years. He asked her, in a voice barely above a whisper, if there was still a version of them worth saving. She did not answer that night. She simply closed her eyes and said she was tired, and he understood that her tiredness was about far more than the hospital bed she was lying in. He stayed in that chair until visiting hours ended. A nurse gently reminded him it was time to go. He stood, looked at his wife's sleeping face, and for the first time in years he actually looked at her. Really looked. The small lines near her eyes that had not been there when they married. The way her jaw was tight even in sleep, like she was still holding something in. The wedding ring on her finger, worn thin from years of use, years he had barely noticed passing. Before he left, a different nurse stopped him near the doorway and asked, gently, if he was the husband. He said yes. She studied him for a moment, the way people study someone they are trying to decide whether to trust with something important. She told him that when Alina had first been brought in, disoriented and weak, the first words she managed to say clearly were not his name. They were her sister's number, recited from memory, calm and precise. The way a person recites information they have quietly prepared in advance for a moment they always suspected might come. Marcus asked carefully what she meant by that. The nurse only shrugged, saying she had seen it before, patients who kept a small list of people to call ready in their minds, just in case, and that it usually meant something about who a person had learned to depend on. She did not say it unkindly. She simply said it and walked away to attend to another room, leaving Marcus standing in the hallway with a new weight settling over the old one. He walked out of the hospital into a parking lot lit by a single flickering street lamp. He sat in his car but did not start the engine. He just sat there, staring at the wheel, replaying every missed dinner, every unread text, every moment he had chosen work over her without even realizing he was choosing anything at all. His phone buzzed again. Another work email. He looked at the screen, at the small red notification bubble that used to control so much of his attention, and for the first time it meant nothing to him. He turned the phone face down on the passenger seat. He drove home in silence. No radio, no calls, just the hum of the engine and the sound of his own thoughts, louder than they had been in years. When he walked into the house, it felt different. Not because anything had changed physically, because he was seeing it differently. Her reading chair by the window, unused in weeks, her favorite mug sitting alone in the drying rack. Small, quiet evidence of a life he had shared with someone he had somehow stopped truly seeing. He sat down on the couch, still in his coat, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, Marcus Whitfield cried. Not out of fear that his wife might have died. Out of a deeper, harder truth. That even if she lived, he might have already lost her a long time ago, one missed moment at a time, without ever noticing it happening. The house was silent around him, and in that silence, he made a quiet promise to himself. He did not know yet if it would be enough. He did not know if there was still time. But he promised himself that from this night forward, he would finally learn how to truly see the woman he had married before it was too late to matter. Alina came home 3 days later. Marcus had cleaned the house from top to bottom, not because she asked him to, but because it was the only language he knew how to speak when words felt too small. He had bought fresh flowers. He had cooked her favorite meal, badly, burning the edges of the rice, but he left it on the table anyway because trying mattered more than perfection. She walked through the door slowly, still weak from the hospital stay, and looked at the flowers, then the table, then him. She did not smile the way he hoped she would. She simply nodded and said thank you, in a voice that was polite but distant, like she was speaking to a coworker instead of a husband. That distance hurt more than an argument would have. An argument meant she still had fire left for him. This quiet politeness felt like something else entirely. It felt like a door slowly closing. Over the next 2 weeks, Marcus tried everything he could think of. He came home early from work, sometimes leaving meetings unfinished, something he would never have done before. He cooked dinner most nights. He asked Alina questions about her day, real questions, and waited patiently for real answers instead of checking his phone while she spoke. At first, Alina answered him carefully, giving short replies, testing whether his sudden change was real or just another passing moment that would fade once the fear from the hospital wore off. She had seen versions of this before, small bursts of attention after an argument, followed by weeks of silence once life returned to normal. She was not cruel about her doubt. She was simply protecting herself from being disappointed again. One evening, while washing dishes together, something neither of them had done in years, Marcus asked her a question that had been sitting heavy in his chest since the hospital. He asked her when exactly she had stopped waiting for him. Alina's hand stopped moving in the soapy water. She stared down at the sink for a long moment before answering. She told him it did not happen in one single moment. It happened slowly, the way a plant dies from lack of water, not all at once, but a little bit every single day, until one morning you look at it and realize it is already gone. She told him about the small things that had built up over the years. The birthdays where he was present physically but somewhere else mentally, scrolling through his phone at the dinner table. The vacations he canceled last minute because of work, promising to make it up to her, and then never quite doing so. The nights she had cried alone in the bathroom with the fan running so he would not hear her through the door, because some small part of her still did not want to burden him, even though he was the reason for her tears. Marcus listened without interrupting, something that took real effort for a man used to fixing problems immediately with quick solutions. He realized, standing there with a wet dish towel in his hands, that this was not a problem he could fix with a single grand gesture. This was years of small neglect, and it would take more than flowers and a burned dinner to repair it. He asked her, gently, if she still loved him. It was the most frightening question he had ever asked another human being. Alina took a long time to answer. She said love was not the problem. She still loved him, somewhere underneath all the exhaustion and disappointment. The problem, she said, was that loving him had started to feel like loving someone who was never really there, even when he was standing right in front of her. That sentence stayed with Marcus for days. He replayed it during his commute, during meetings where he used to be fully present but now found his mind drifting back to her words. He began to understand something uncomfortable about himself. He had always believed that providing financially was the same thing as being present emotionally. He had told himself that working late nights and taking on extra projects was an act of love, a way of building a good life for both of them. He never stopped to ask Alina if that was the kind of love she actually needed. He started noticing small details about her life that he had somehow missed for years. She had a pottery class she attended on Wednesday evenings, something she had started nearly a year earlier. He had never asked about it. He had never seen a single piece she had made. When he finally asked her about it one night, she looked at him with genuine surprise, as if she could not believe he was actually curious. She showed him a small clay bowl she had made months earlier, imperfect and slightly uneven on one side. She told him it was the first thing she had made entirely by herself, without anyone's help or opinion, in a very long time. There was pride in her voice when she spoke about it, a version of pride he had not heard directed at anything in their shared life for years. Marcus asked if he could come watch her class sometime. She hesitated before answering, and that hesitation told him more than words could. It told him that her pottery class had become a space that belonged only to her, a place where she did not have to think about him, about their marriage, about anything that had been slowly wearing her down. He understood painfully that his sudden interest might feel less like love and more like an intrusion into the only peace she had left. He did not push the subject further that night. Instead, he asked if there was anything he could do differently, something practical, something real. Alina thought for a moment and told him something small but important. She said she did not need grand gestures or expensive gifts. She needed him to remember the small things. She needed him to ask about her day and actually listen to the answer. She needed him to notice when she was struggling before she had to say it out loud. Marcus nodded slowly, taking in every word like a man trying to memorize a language he should have learned years earlier. He began writing small notes to himself on his phone, reminders about things Alina mentioned in passing conversations, so he would not forget them the way he used to. Her friend's name from work who was going through a difficult divorce. The dentist appointment she had mentioned once, weeks in advance. The small ache in her shoulder from sitting too long at her desk. One Saturday morning, an old friend of theirs named Daniel stopped by unannounced. Someone Marcus had once considered close before work slowly swallowed most of his personal friendships along with his marriage. Daniel had known them since before the wedding, and he greeted Marcus with the easy warmth of someone who had not seen him properly in over a year. Over coffee at the kitchen table, Daniel mentioned, almost casually, that he had run into Alina a few months earlier at a farmer's market, and that she had seemed different, lighter in some ways, but also more guarded than he remembered. He asked, without any real accusation in his voice, if everything was all right between them. Marcus found himself unable to give a simple answer. He admitted, for the first time to someone outside the marriage, that things had been difficult, that he was only now beginning to understand how difficult, and for how long. Daniel listened without judgment, then told him something that stayed with Marcus for days afterward. He said that he had always assumed Marcus and Alina had one of those easy marriages, the kind that seemed to run on its own momentum without much visible effort. He said it was strange to realize now how much can be hidden behind a couple's public appearance, how a marriage can look steady from the outside while quietly falling apart within. After Daniel left, Marcus sat alone in the kitchen turning that comment over in his mind. He realized he had spent years performing the appearance of a functioning marriage, showing up at gatherings, posting the occasional photograph, answering easily whenever anyone asked how Alina was doing, without ever pausing to notice that his own private answer to that question had grown less and less true with each passing year. Slowly, over the following weeks, small cracks of warmth began to return between them. Alina still kept a careful distance, unwilling to fully trust that this change was permanent, but she allowed small moments of connection to happen again. A shared laugh over a mistake in the kitchen. A quiet evening on the couch watching a show they both used to enjoy years earlier. back when watching television together was still something they did as a couple, instead of two people sharing the same room while looking at separate phones. A few days later, Alina mentioned, almost in passing, that her mother had called asking why she sounded different lately, calmer in some ways but also more tired underneath it. Alina had not told her mother about the hospital, not wanting to worry her from a distance, and Marcus realized, listening to her describe the conversation, how much Alina had been quietly managing on her own, protecting other people from her own struggles even while struggling herself. He asked her gently why she had not told her mother the full truth. Alina considered the question for a moment before answering honestly. She said she had spent so many years being the steady one in her family, the one who handled things calmly, that admitting she had collapsed from exhaustion felt like admitting a kind of failure she was not ready to explain out loud yet, especially while she herself was still trying to understand exactly what had gone wrong. Marcus told her carefully that needing help was not the same as failing, and immediately heard how strange those words sounded coming from a man who had spent years avoiding exactly that same kind of vulnerability himself. Alina noticed it too, offering a small, tired smile, the first genuine smile he had seen from her in weeks. She told him that perhaps they were both learning the same lesson at the same time, just from different directions. One night, Alina's sister Nora came over for dinner. Marcus had always found Nora slightly intimidating, sharp-tongued and fiercely protective of her sister. During dinner, Nora asked him directly, without softening the question, if he understood how close he had come to losing Alina completely, not just to a hospital bed, but to a version of herself that had already stopped fighting for their marriage long before she collapsed. Marcus admitted honestly that he had not understood, not really, until that night in the hospital chair. He admitted that he had spent years assuming their marriage was fine simply because Alina had not complained loudly enough for him to notice something was wrong. He realized, saying it out loud for the first time, how unfair that assumption had been. He had built an entire understanding of his marriage based on the absence of complaints, rather than the presence of genuine connection. Nora studied him for a long moment after he finished speaking. She told him something Alina herself had not yet said directly. She told him that Alina had almost left him twice in the past year, packing a bag both times before ultimately deciding to stay, not because things had gotten better, but because she was too exhausted to start over completely. That information hit Marcus harder than anything the doctor had told him at the hospital. He had been so focused on the collapse, the medical emergency, that he had not fully considered how close he had come to losing Alina in an entirely different way, through her own quiet decision to walk away. After Nora left that night, Marcus sat with Alina on the porch steps, the evening air cool around them. He asked her carefully if what Nora said was true. Alina did not deny it. She told him about the first time, nearly a year earlier, when she had packed a bag after a particularly painful anniversary that he had completely forgotten. She had sat in her car in the driveway for nearly an hour, deciding whether to drive to her sister's house or walk back inside. She chose to walk back inside, not because things had improved, but because some small, stubborn part of her still believed their marriage was worth one more try. She told him about the second time, only a few months before her collapse, after a work trip he had canceled attending because of a project deadline, a trip that had meant more to her than he ever understood. She had packed a bag again that night, sitting on the edge of their bed for a long time before finally unpacking it, telling herself she was simply too tired to deal with the practical difficulties of leaving. Marcus listened to all of this in silence, understanding for the first time just how fragile their marriage had actually been, hidden beneath the surface of ordinary daily life. He had been living inside a marriage that was quietly ending, without ever noticing the signs, because he had never truly learned how to see his wife as a full and separate person with her own exhaustion, her own limits, and her own quiet decisions being made every single day about whether to stay or go. That night, lying awake beside Alina, Marcus made a decision that felt different from the promises he had made before. He decided that understanding what he had almost lost was not enough. He needed to actually become a different kind of husband, not through grand declarations, but through the slow, unglamorous work of showing up, day after day, in the small ways that actually mattered to the woman he had married but had somehow, for years, failed to truly see. In the days that followed, he began a quiet habit that felt strange at first, almost foolish. Each evening before falling asleep, he wrote down one small thing he had noticed about Alina that day, something true and specific, not a general compliment but a real detail. The way she tucked a strand of hair behind her ear while concentrating on a difficult piece of clay work. The particular sigh she made when a phone call with her mother had gone on too long. The small furrow that appeared between her eyebrows when she was worried about something she had not yet decided to share with him. He did not show her this list. It was not meant for her, not yet. It was meant for himself, a way of training his own attention back toward a person he had once known completely and had slowly stopped watching. Weeks later, looking back through the growing collection of small observations, he would understand it as the beginning of something larger, the slow rebuilding of a habit he should never have allowed himself to lose in the first place, the simple, ordinary habit of actually paying attention to the person he loved. The phone rang at 6 in the morning, 6 weeks after Alina came home from the hospital. It was his manager, and the voice on the other end carried the kind of urgency that used to control every part of Marcus's life. A major client had pulled out of a deal overnight, threatening the entire quarter, and the company needed every available person in the office immediately to save the contract before it collapsed completely. Marcus felt the old pull instantly, a familiar tightening in his chest that used to mean one thing and one thing only: work first, everything else later. For 6 weeks he had been proud of himself, coming home early, being present, learning to listen. Standing in his kitchen at 6 in the morning with his manager's panicked voice in his ear, he felt that progress trembling under the weight of old habits that had never fully disappeared, only gone quiet for a while. He told his manager he would be there within the hour. He hung up the phone and turned around to find Alina standing in the doorway, still in her pajamas, watching him with an expression he recognized immediately, because he had seen it 100 times before their marriage nearly broke apart. It was the look of someone bracing for disappointment before it had even fully arrived. He told her it was an emergency, just this once, a client crisis that could cost the company millions if it was not handled immediately. He promised he would be home for dinner. Alina said nothing at first, just nodded slowly, the kind of nod that carries more weight than any argument could. The next few days blurred together in a way Marcus recognized from years earlier, back when work consumed every waking hour and Alina existed somewhere on the edges of his attention, present but not truly seen. The client crisis stretched longer than expected. Meetings ran late into the night. Dinner promises were broken, first by an hour, then by entire evenings. Marcus told himself each time that it was temporary, that once this crisis passed, he would return fully to the man he had been becoming over the past 6 weeks. On the 4th night he came home after 11, exhausted, his tie loosened, his mind still running through numbers and contract clauses. He found the house dark except for a single lamp in the living room. Alina was sitting on the couch, wide awake, waiting for him in a way that reminded him painfully of the years before her collapse, years he had promised himself would never return. She asked him quietly if this was how it was going to be again. Not angry, just tired in a way that scared him more than anger ever could. He tried to explain the situation, the client, the numbers, the pressure from above, but as the words left his mouth, he heard how hollow they sounded, how similar they were to explanations he had given 100 times before, back when those explanations had slowly worn away everything good between them. He tried to explain how the past 10 days had felt from the inside, the constant pressure from senior leadership, the fear that a single mistake could unravel months of careful client management, the way each night he had told himself tomorrow would be different, only to find tomorrow swallowed by the same urgent demands as the day before. He knew, even as he spoke, that none of it changed what those same 10 days had felt like from Alina's side of the kitchen table, waiting alone through dinners that grew cold, wondering which version of him would eventually walk back through the door. Alina listened without interrupting. When he finished, she told him something that landed like a physical blow. She said she understood emergencies happened, that she was not asking for perfection. What frightened her, she said, was not this one difficult week. What frightened her was recognizing the exact rhythm of the years that had almost destroyed them, the same excuses, the same tone of voice, the same slow retreat back into a version of him that made her feel invisible. Marcus wanted to argue that this was different, that it was temporary, but some honest part of him understood that she was not entirely wrong. The crisis at work had given him an easy excuse to fall back into familiar patterns, patterns that were comfortable precisely because they required nothing new from him. No growth, no discomfort, just the same old habits dressed up as necessity. He promised her again that things would return to normal once the crisis passed. Alina looked at him for a long moment, then said something quietly devastating. She said she had heard that same promise before, many times, and each time she had believed it a little less than the time before. On the 7th night of the crisis, a colleague named Priya, who had worked alongside Marcus for nearly 6 years, found him still at his desk long after most of the office had emptied out. She set a cup of coffee down beside him without being asked and sat in the chair across from his desk, studying him with the kind of familiarity that comes from years of shared long nights. She asked him bluntly if this was worth it. Marcus assumed she meant the contract, the numbers, the pressure from above, and began explaining the stakes of the deal. Priya shook her head and clarified that she was not asking about the contract at all. She was asking about the dark circles under his eyes that had nothing to do with lost sleep from work, and the way he kept glancing at his phone every few minutes, not checking messages, just staring at the screen as if willing a different message to appear. Marcus admitted quietly that Alina had almost left him once already, months earlier, before everything had seemed to improve, and that some part of him was terrified this crisis was proving her right to have doubted him at all. Priya listened, then told him something he had not expected from a colleague who had only ever known the version of him fully devoted to the company. She said she had watched him give everything to this job for 6 years, and that she had always privately wondered what it was costing him at home, though it had never felt like her place to ask. Her honesty unsettled him more than any client emergency had that week. He sat at his desk long after she left, the coffee going cold beside him, staring at the glowing numbers on his monitor without truly seeing them, his mind circling back again and again to the quiet, tired look on Alina's face the night before, the look of someone watching a familiar pattern repeat itself despite every hope that it would not. The crisis at work finally resolved after 10 difficult days, the client contract saved, his manager praising him publicly for his dedication during the emergency. Marcus felt a small, familiar satisfaction at the praise, the same kind of validation that had once meant everything to him. But walking to his car that evening, phone buzzing with congratulatory messages from colleagues, he felt something else too. A hollow unease settling in his stomach, because he suddenly could not remember the last genuine conversation he had shared with Alina during those 10 days. He drove home that evening determined to make things right, to return fully to the man he had promised to become. He walked through the front door expecting to find Alina in the kitchen or the living room, ready to explain that the crisis was finally over, that he was fully back now, that things could return to how they had been during those 6 good weeks. The house was too quiet. He called her name and no answer came back. He walked through the rooms one by one, an uneasy feeling growing heavier with each empty space he passed. Her reading chair by the window sat empty. Her side of the closet, when he finally checked, had noticeable gaps where clothes used to hang. On the kitchen counter, where the flowers had once sat weeks earlier, There was a single folded piece of paper with his name written on it in Alina's familiar handwriting. His hands were shaking slightly as he unfolded it. The note was short, shorter than he expected given the weight of what it represented. She wrote that she was staying with her sister for a while, that she needed space to think clearly about her own life without the constant hope and disappointment that came from waiting to see which version of Marcus would show up each day. She wrote that she was not angry, which somehow made the note harder to read than if she had been furious. She wrote that she loved him, but that loving him had started to feel like a battle she was tired of fighting alone. Marcus stood in the kitchen holding that piece of paper for a long time, the silence of the house pressing in around him from every direction. He thought about calling her immediately, driving straight to her sister's house, demanding a conversation, fixing this the way he had once fixed contract disputes and client emergencies at work. Something stopped him. A quiet, uncomfortable understanding that showing up with urgency and demands was exactly the kind of behavior that had driven her away in the first place, treating their marriage like a crisis to be solved through force and immediate action, rather than patient, consistent care. He called Nora, his hand still trembling slightly as he dialed. She answered on the second ring, her voice careful, clearly expecting the call. She confirmed that Alina had arrived that afternoon, quiet but composed, carrying only a single bag, saying she needed time to think without offering much more explanation than that. Nora told him, not unkindly, that Alina had asked her not to let him come over that night, that she needed the first evening alone to settle her thoughts without the pressure of a conversation neither of them was ready to have yet. Marcus respected the request, though every instinct in his body wanted to drive straight to Nora's house regardless. He thanked her, hung up the phone, and sat down at the kitchen table instead, the note still in his hand, and allowed himself to fully feel the weight of what had happened. 6 weeks of genuine effort and one difficult work crisis had been enough to unravel it all. Not because the effort had been fake, but because real change, real transformation, required more than 6 weeks of good behavior during calm circumstances. It required consistency even when life became difficult, even when old habits offered an easier, more familiar path. He thought about calling his manager the next morning to explain that he needed to step back from certain responsibilities, that his marriage needed him more than the company did. He rehearsed the words in his mind, imagining how strange they would sound coming from a man who had spent over a decade building his identity around being indispensable at work. That night, alone in the too-quiet house, Marcus did something he had not done in years. He sat down and wrote a long letter to Alina, not to send immediately, but simply to organize the thoughts that had been tangled in his chest since finding her note. He wrote about the fear that had driven him back into old patterns during the crisis, the fear of failing publicly at work, a fear that had somehow felt larger and more urgent than the quieter, more important fear of failing privately at home. He wrote about the specific moments from their marriage that he now understood differently, moments where his absence had been a choice disguised as necessity. He wrote about the version of himself he wanted to become, not the version who fixed problems quickly and moved on, but the version who stayed present through difficulty, who chose Alina consistently rather than only when it was convenient. He thought, too, about the version of the future he had quietly assumed would always be waiting for him, a future where he worked hard now so that later, someday, there would be time for everything else, for travel, for slower mornings, for the kind of closeness he and Alina had shared before responsibility crowded it out. He realized, sitting alone in the dark kitchen, that he had been living inside that promise of someday for over a decade, treating the present as something temporary and disposable, a placeholder to be endured rather than a life to actually be lived. He thought about all the ordinary evenings he had missed without even registering them as losses, dinners eaten separately, weekends spent partly at the office, small moments of connection postponed again and again, in favor of a future that kept receding further away with every choice that pushed it back. He understood now that someday was not a place a person eventually arrived at automatically. It had to be built, deliberately, out of the very days he had been so carelessly spending. He did not sleep much that night. Around 3 in the morning, he found himself standing in Alina's small home office, a room she used for reading and paying bills, a room he rarely entered. On her desk sat a stack of pottery photographs, pieces she had made over the past year that he had never asked to see in detail. He looked through them slowly in the dim light, noticing the gradual improvement in her skill, the growing confidence visible in each piece, evidence of an entire creative life she had built quietly while he had been elsewhere, physically and emotionally, for years. Among the photographs, he found something that stopped him completely. A small folded drawing, clearly old, the paper soft with age. It was a simple sketch Alina had made years earlier, during the early days of their marriage, of the two of them standing together outside their first small apartment, holding hands, smiling in a way that felt achingly distant from where they now stood. Underneath the drawing, in her handwriting, faded but still legible, were 3 words: "Someday, still us." Marcus sat down on the floor of that small office, the drawing in his hands, and allowed himself to fully grieve what he had lost, not through her collapse in the hospital, not through the note on the kitchen counter, but through years of small, quiet neglect that had slowly eroded something precious without him ever fully noticing, until it was almost entirely gone. He understood, sitting there in the early hours of the morning, that winning Alina back would require more than apologies or grand promises. It would require him to actually become, consistently and permanently, the man in that old drawing, the one who chose her not just during calm weeks, but especially during the difficult ones, when choosing her required real sacrifice rather than convenient effort. He folded the drawing carefully and placed it in his wallet, a quiet reminder he intended to carry with him from that day forward, whether or not Alina ever agreed to come home. The next morning, Marcus walked into his manager's office before the workday had fully begun. He explained, calmly and without apology, that he needed to reduce his hours for a period of time, that a family matter required his full attention. His manager, still riding the recent success of the saved contract, tried to argue that this was the worst possible timing, that Marcus was becoming too valuable to step back now. Marcus listened politely, then repeated his decision without wavering, something he would not have been capable of doing 6 months earlier, when work had always won every internal argument without a real fight. His manager pushed back harder than expected, mentioning an upcoming promotion that required full availability, hinting that stepping back now could quietly cost him that opportunity for years to come. Marcus felt the old fear rise in his chest, the fear of falling behind, of being seen as less driven than his colleagues, a fear that had once been powerful enough to override almost anything else in his life. He sat with that fear for a moment, acknowledged it honestly, and then told his manager calmly that he understood the risk and was choosing to accept it anyway. Walking out of that office, he felt strangely lighter, as though he had set down a weight he had been carrying so long he had stopped noticing its size. He did not go directly to Nora's house that day. He understood, uncomfortably, that showing up immediately with urgency would only confirm Alina's fear that he responded to crisis with pressure rather than patience. Instead, he spent the day doing something that felt strange and unfamiliar. He went looking for the parts of Alina's life he had never bothered to learn. He found the pottery studio first, a small building tucked between a bakery and a bookstore, one he had driven past hundreds of times without ever noticing it. Inside, he introduced himself to the instructor, a woman with clay-stained hands and kind eyes, who recognized his name immediately. She told him, with a gentle honesty that stung more than it comforted, that Alina talked about her marriage sometimes during breaks between lessons, always carefully, never bitterly, but with a tiredness that had worried the instructor more than once. The instructor showed him a shelf near the back of the studio where finished pieces waited to be collected. Among them sat several pieces Marcus had never seen, bowls and small vases, each one showing a steady improvement in skill and confidence. He stood there for a long time, looking at physical proof of an entire creative journey his wife had taken without him, not because she wanted to hide it from him, but because he had simply never asked. From the pottery studio, he drove to a small coffee shop 3 streets over, a place Alina had mentioned once in passing months earlier, a place he now remembered only because guilt had sharpened his memory in ways attention never had before. He found her name written on a small card near the counter, part of a loyalty program, and realized this ordinary coffee shop had likely witnessed more of his wife's quiet victories and struggles over the past year than he ever had. He did not go to Nora's house that evening either. Instead, he sat down and wrote a second letter, shorter than the first, and drove it to Nora's house himself, sliding it carefully under the front door rather than knocking. He did not ask to see Alina. He simply left the letter and drove away, understanding that respecting the space she had asked for was itself a form of the change he was trying to prove was real. 3 days passed with no response. Marcus continued the quiet work of understanding, without pushing for contact. He read books about relationships for the first time in his life, not out of obligation, but out of genuine curiosity about what he had been missing for over a decade. He began seeing a therapist, something he had always dismissed in the past as unnecessary, and found himself surprised by how much he did not know about his own patterns, his own fears, the quiet ways he had learned, long before Alina, to hide behind achievement rather than face emotional vulnerability directly. During one early session, the therapist, a calm woman named Priscilla with a habit of asking short, direct questions, asked Marcus to describe his own parents' marriage growing up. He found himself describing a household where his father worked constantly, praised often for his dedication at community gatherings, while his mother quietly managed everything else, her own needs rarely discussed openly by anyone in the family. He had never once, before that session, considered how closely he had recreated that exact pattern in his own marriage, treating long hours and financial provision as the complete definition of a good husband, exactly the way his father had. The realization did not arrive as a single dramatic breakthrough. It settled slowly, over several sessions, as Marcus began recognizing the same quiet justifications in his own thinking that he remembered his father using decades earlier. Phrases about providing for the family, about sacrifice, about love expressed through effort rather than presence. Understanding where the pattern came from did not excuse it, but it gave him something he had not had before, a clear target to actively work against rather than a vague, shapeless flaw he did not know how to address. On the 4th day, Nora called him, her voice softer than it had been during their last conversation. She told him Alina had read both letters, multiple times, and that something in her expression had shifted slightly, though she remained cautious. Nora suggested, carefully, that Alina might be willing to meet him for coffee, somewhere neutral, somewhere that did not carry the weight of their shared home. They met at the small coffee shop Marcus had discovered days earlier, though he never told Alina that detail, not wanting the moment to feel like a performance designed to impress her. Alina arrived first, sitting at a corner table, her posture careful and guarded in a way that reminded him painfully of a stranger rather than a wife of 11 years. He sat down across from her, resisting every urge to fill the silence immediately with apologies or promises. He had learned, slowly and uncomfortably, that Alina did not need more words from him. She needed proof, patient and consistent, spread across time rather than compressed into a single desperate conversation. She asked him, eventually, why he had stepped back from work. He explained honestly, without exaggeration, that he had realized his hours at the office had become a hiding place, a way of avoiding the harder, more uncertain work of being truly present in his marriage. He told her about the therapist, about the books, about the quiet mornings spent trying to understand himself more honestly than he ever had before. Alina listened carefully, her expression difficult to read. When he finished, she told him something that landed with quiet weight. She said she appreciated the effort genuinely, but that effort alone was not the same as trust, and trust, once broken repeatedly over many years, could not be rebuilt through a few good weeks or a few thoughtful letters. She said she needed to see this version of him sustained over real time, through real difficulty, before she could allow herself to believe it was permanent. Marcus nodded, understanding that her caution was not cruelty but self-protection, earned through years of disappointment he himself had caused. He told her he understood, that he was not asking her to come home immediately, that he simply wanted the chance to keep showing up, consistently, for as long as it took her to believe him again. Over the following weeks, a careful new rhythm began to form between them. They met regularly, sometimes for coffee, sometimes for quiet walks in the park near Nora's house, always in neutral spaces that belonged to neither their old marriage nor entirely to Alina's new independent life. Marcus asked questions and genuinely listened to the answers. He learned about the friends Alina had made through her pottery class, people he had never met, people who had supported her during months when he himself had not. During one of their walks, Alina told him about a moment months earlier, during the lowest point of their separation, when she had seriously considered filing for divorce, had even gone as far as researching a lawyer recommended by a coworker. She had sat in her car outside the lawyer's office for nearly 20 minutes, the engine running, before finally driving away without going inside. She told Marcus this not to punish him, but because she believed he deserved to understand exactly how close they had come to an ending that could not have been undone. Marcus absorbed this information silently, grateful in a way he could not fully articulate that she had chosen honesty over protecting him from the full truth. He told her, after a long pause, that he was glad she had not gone inside that day, and immediately understood how small and inadequate those words sounded against the weight of what she had shared. Alina simply nodded, accepting the inadequacy of language in that moment, understanding that some truths did not require a perfect response, only an honest witness. He learned, slowly and humbly, the full scope of what he had missed. A close friend of Alina's had gone through a difficult health scare during a period when Marcus had been consumed by a different work project, and Alina had carried that worry largely alone, unable to lean on a husband who was rarely emotionally available. He learned about small personal victories she had experienced, a difficult piece of pottery finally completed successfully, a challenging conversation with her own mother handled with newfound confidence, moments of growth that had happened entirely outside his awareness. Each new piece of information landed with a quiet ache, not from jealousy, but from the growing understanding of just how much of his wife's inner life he had missed simply because he had stopped asking, stopped noticing, stopped treating her as someone whose daily experiences deserved his genuine curiosity. One afternoon, during a walk through the park, Alina mentioned an upcoming pottery exhibition where several of her pieces would be displayed publicly for the first time. She mentioned it casually, almost testing him, watching to see if he would ask more questions, or simply let the comment pass the way he might have done in the past. Marcus asked, carefully, if he could attend. Alina hesitated, the same hesitation he remembered from months earlier when he had first asked about her pottery class. This time, however, after a long pause, she said yes, quietly, watching his reaction closely. He did not make a large gesture out of her answer. He simply thanked her calmly and asked what time the exhibition began. That restraint, that willingness to accept a small victory without turning it into something larger than it was, seemed to register with Alina in a way he had not anticipated. For the first time since the hospital, he saw something soften slightly in her expression, not full trust, not yet, but the smallest opening of a door that had been closed for a long time. As they continued walking, Alina asked him a question that surprised him with its directness. She asked if he was truly ready to accept that rebuilding trust might take years rather than months, that there might never be a single dramatic moment where everything suddenly became perfect again. Only a long, patient accumulation of small, consistent choices over time. Marcus stopped walking for a moment, considering his answer carefully before speaking. He told her that he understood now, more clearly than he ever had before, that he had spent years believing love was something you earned once, and then simply maintained through habit and comfort. He told her he now understood love as something requiring active choice every single day, a choice he intended to keep making, regardless of how long it took her to